Now, let's make it perfectly clear.
In the early years, Robert Muldoon was probably the best Minister of Finance we've had, and his economic spells seemed to work.
He did a tremendous service to New Zealand because of his extraordinary precision and power. He grabbed what was a very difficult situation.
Minhinnick did a cartoon the week I was appointed, which he called The New Batsman. It had all these Australian fieldsmen crouching around a new batsman, which was me, and things like wool slump, inflation, and all kinds of drawn on their backs. And that's how I felt.
In the 60s, we were still affluent. The traditional economic remedies still seemed to work, particularly when practiced by someone as good with figures as Robert Muldoon.
From the purely finance side, I would certainly rate him number one.
Had a very sharp mind, very good grasp of the issues and the problems at that time.
The cost of his promises and how he's going to finance them.
Muldoon made his brilliant bush economics a daily feature of New Zealand life. He peddled many budgets like snake oil. And always there were figures.
Mr. Kirk's been talking about my figures and his figures, and I've been talking about my figures and his figures.
Muldoon was also building a political style which was reaching out to a broader audience. At first, it was not based on fear. It was Muldoon as the direct, no-nonsense, tell-it-like-it-is kind of man you could trust.
30th of June, 19...
Of course, he handled it brilliantly, basically because he told the truth or told it straight.
Very succinct, precise, forthright sort of statements were coming from this fellow Muldoon, an Auckland MP, and they stood out because they were bold, if you like. They were saying what people were thinking, but in those days people weren't bold in the House.
The Holyoake era, so to speak, had been characterised by an awful lot of flummery and froth and pomposity, and it came straight from the shoulder, so to speak, and his popularity just soared.
There were increasing concerns about the brash, abrasive Muldoon style.
About time too.
A lady says at the back, about time too.
But a lot of people liked him, and his sure hand with the economy would help his inexorable drive to the top.
We got to the position by 1972, 6 years later, where for the first time in our history we were in credit in our overseas funds. I certainly felt very good about that period of 6 years. Of course, I was Deputy Prime Minister by then, so I suppose the Prime Minister thing had come into sight, as it were.
Muldoon may be too tough.
Thank you very much. The question of leadership. Whether or not this country has got, as Prime Minister, a man who's a leader.
Robert Muldoon was already politically tough when he arrived in Parliament. Disappointment would only toughen him further. His biggest was losing the national leadership battle to Jack Marshall when Keith Holyoake stepped down in '72.
And I informed my caucus colleagues that I had a very strong wish to retire from the leadership of the party.
Mr. Jack Marshall has been elected as the new Prime Minister and Mr. Muldoon as his deputy.
Mr. Muldoon and I will work very well together.
He and I have totally different styles, but there's room for both.
But there wasn't. And when Norman Kirk took Labour to power in '72, his victory doomed Jack Marshall and made way for the rise of Robert Muldoon.
We've got a big majority, so that means that New Zealand's in for a long period of political stability.
Because Prime Minister Kirk dominated the House, and only the toughie from Tamaki could handle him, as Marshall sadly realised.
A more aggressive approach seems to be called for by a significant majority of our supporters.
Ever expedient, the National Party went for the man most likely to put them back in power.
For 6 weeks, the discussions went on about whether it should be Marshall or Muldoon until the final conclusion. And it came a tremendous shock to the country, and I might say to the National Party.
When Jack went overseas, I think he called up his credits with caucus. By the time Jack came back, Rob, I think, was fairly confident of his numbers.
And he'd always been good at numbers. Now Robert Muldoon had the power of the party. All he needed was the power of the people.
November 1974. It's not actually election year in New Zealand, but the country's opposition leader, Robert Muldoon, has decided to meet the people.
As he set out on his extraordinary Meet the People campaign, Robert Muldoon showed even more the curious contradiction in his nature, which made him reach out publicly in a way he could never do personally. Surrounded by people at a function, he was somehow always alone and aloof.
Never would he go.
But publicly, he was our most prolific political communicator, pouring forth speeches, books, talkback shows, commercials, stage shows.
He was happy when he was the subject of attention and commanding attention. There is about him, in my remembrance of him anyhow, a certain sadness that there was an inability on his part to be intimate. And there had to be the pretense of distance.
I sort of felt sorry for him, so I went off and said, you know, try to make small talk, but that didn't get very far, so then I sort of started to talk business, and he immediately cheered up enormously, as happy as could be, and he started to discuss work. And it was really very sad.
Muldoon, to me, was always masked.
He'll play against anyone, anywhere. And he won't thank any government for interfering, and this government's not going to interfere.
With the mask firmly in place, Muldoon went to the public in the most remarkable barnstorming campaign since King Dick's Eden. Even before he took the leadership from Jack Marshall, Muldoon had been on his soapbox. But by early '74, with an election still almost 2 years away, he was filling halls throughout the country.
So I kept on having these very frequently all over the country in the various provincial areas, invariably full halls and people overflowing outside. And we just thought, we're going to win. Then, of course, Norman Kirk died at the end of August of that year. And I think some of those who'd been a little bit skeptical prior to that began to feel that there was going to be a change of government. I think that's really when it came.
Just 20 months after an astonishing election victory, he made his final journey from the House of Representatives.
By the time of Kirk's death, the third Labour government was already rattled. The first oil shock had struck hard, we were deep in debt, and people were worried. But with Kirk, the Labour giant, dead, Muldoon had a clear run.
I thought I knew him, and I thought I could stand up to him in an election campaign one-on-one. As it turned out, I got Bill rolling.
Increasingly, Muldoon projected himself as the tough guy who would get us out of trouble. He assassinated Bill Rolling as weak and ineffectual. But there were mounting fears that the National Party had turned a monster loose. Fears confirmed for many one Sunday in August '74 when he made a confrontational appearance on David Frost's TV special.
This so-called sergeant major that would have been tossed out of my unit.
And that same night, he punched demonstrators outside the Peter Pan ballroom.
And you see that wonderful shot of him punching his way through the crowds in Queen Street on a Sunday night. He's got a parcel under his arm. It's a set of opera records that I presented him as the guest speaker.
Back there in Parliament buildings with policies...
When he first entered Parliament, he said he had too many friends and what he needed was some enemies. Soon he would be creating them daily. It was part of his plan.
Politicians, you know, people are basically gutless, and he said, you watch the behaviour of most of them, they are always trying to win their enemies. Muldoon observed this behaviour, and he said, to hell with it. He said, you're never going to get their votes. Kick the hell out of them.
And he did.